A group of peace-minded Washington institutions, the American for Peace Now, the American Task Force for Palestine, Brit Tzedek, Shalom, the Arab American Institute, the Israel Policy Forum, and Churches for Middle East Peace. Let me explain a bit about the format. I'm going to ask questions to the panelists, and I hope that you'll help me by sending in your own questions. There'll be cards distributed to you. We'll have time for question and answer. We have until 2 o'clock for those of you who can stay. Before I begin, I would like to observe with sorrow the passing of Congressman Henry Hyde, a distinguished American legislator who in his last of many important roles was the chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a man whose integrity and vision we all admired, and we mourn his passing. I'd like to also recognize two people whom I think are here, Michael Hare of Congressman Bustani's office, and Dallas Blumenfeld of Congressman Ackerman's office. I want to thank both of you for helping organizing this event, and to thank your principals for the terrific work they have done in rallying support in the Congress for the Annapolis meeting and for this new quest for a two-state peace between Israel and Palestine. Let's give them a hand. Our panel today is a distinguished group of former practitioners, experts, analysts. On my far right, Greg Khalil is a lawyer, graduate of the Yale Law School, Palestinian American. Greg is a member of that distinguished group of experts who have been advising and counseling the Palestinian negotiating team and Prime Minister and President Mahmoud Abbas. Next to Greg, Ori Nir, whom many of you know, is the Public Affairs Director of American for Peace Now, a veteran journalist who has written for both the Haaretz and for the Forward here in Washington. Scott Lizinski, on my right, of the U.S. Institute of Peace, is the co-author with Dan Kurtzer of a new study of the history of Arab-Israeli peacemaking, which we await with great expectation. Daniel Levy isn't here yet, but Daniel will be here, I'm sure. He is a fellow of the New America Foundation and the director of its Middle East program. Daniel has had a long history in peacemaking as an advisor to Israeli prime ministers and ministers. Daniel was part of the Israeli negotiating team during the 90s. He was a co-drafter of the Geneva Initiative. On my left, Raith Al-Omari is the advocacy director for the American Task Force for Palestine. Raith also is a former negotiator and advisor who worked closely with the advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during the Oslo peace process. He too is a lawyer. We'll go ahead, even though Daniel isn't with us, and we have until 2 o'clock. So let me explain again that I'm going to ask our panelists some questions, and I hope you'll help me by sending your own questions up. Let me turn first to Ray. There is a sense of hope and expectation after the Annapolis meeting, following a long drought in peacemaking. There's also a sense of skepticism. As a veteran observer, practitioner, could you tell us what you think is new in the Annapolis process that is unfolding? What is new that should give us hope that this time the process will be a successful one, while similar processes in the past have failed?
Let me actually start by expressing how amazed I am, A, by the attendance that I see here, by the fact that all of these organizations are bringing this together, and the fact something like the letter that Congressman Ackerman and Bastani produced. This to me is what's new. We have a sense of hope that we're seeing here. Specifically on Annapolis, I would say that there are 5 new elements. I'm sorry, 4 new elements that I see in Annapolis. The first and most obvious is there's a process. After 7 years of no talking, of violence, there's a process. Who would have thought 6-7 months ago that Palestinians and Israelis would be sitting together talking permanent status issues? The Palestinian issue would be back at the center stage of international politics, not as a security issue, not as a financial issue, but a political issue of the first order. That in itself is a progress. Then, practically speaking, the first new element that I see is the role of the Arab countries. Again, for the first time since Madrid, you have the Arab countries sitting in the same room with Israel in a peace process. More importantly, there is the Arab Peace Initiative, which was issued in Beirut, in the Beirut Arab League Summit, which talks about normalization with Israel once we have a comprehensive peace deal. You have an Arab role that's starting to be engaged, and it'd be interesting to see how that role gets developed and how we ensure that the Arab engagement in the process continues to be developed. There is also, again, diplomatically speaking, there's a new development of, for the first time in 7 years, or in a few years, we have an understanding that discussing the big political issues, refugees, Jerusalem, territory, has to go hand in hand with issues on the ground, security, settlement freeze, aspects of the first phase of the roadmap. In the past, the logic has always been, you do things on the ground, then you move towards political negotiations. And this logic has obviously not worked. We have seen clear endorsement by President Bush, by Prime Minister Olmert, and obviously by President Abbas, of having a hand-in-hand, a parallel process with the roadmap. And I would say, and finally, the one last thing is the difference between this negotiation, this phase, and the time when I was a negotiator 7 years ago. When I was a negotiator, we would sit, Israelis, Palestinians, Americans, and try to actually figure out what are the solutions for the permanent status issues from scratch. How do you deal with Jerusalem, how do you deal with the refugees, etc. Now, 7 years later, we know the general contours of the agreement. Whether what happened in Taba that was leaked, whether the Geneva Initiative, the Syria Initiative, the public knows the compromises that need to be made. The negotiators know the compromises that need to be made. Right now, I think we can skip a big phase of the negotiations, trying to figure out what the solutions are, and we can jump straight to the political process of bringing constituencies to agree to these solutions. So I see all of these elements, I see momentum, I see interest. The challenge now is how can we build it, how can we build upon it, how we can design a diplomatic process that will further this momentum.
Thank you, Ray. Let me turn to Scott. Scott, you're a student of Arab-American, Israeli Arab-American peacemaking. What is different about this process that should encourage us? What have we learned of the lessons of the past? The President has said he will be heavily engaged. It appears that Secretary Condoleezza Rice will be his chief negotiator. Can she do this herself? Will she have a large staff of experts as past presidents have had? Look at what past presidents have done and compare that with the initiatives that are now unfolding.
2 minutes? Thank you, Phil, and I thank all the co-sponsors for having me. And I want to join Faith. And I look here, and I was in Annapolis on Tuesday, and not just the number of people in the room, but I look at the co-sponsors, and I wonder if more progress was made here at this event than at the conference. You asked a very good question. Let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that there was this, what I would call pinball diplomacy in the last number of months leading up to this. This conference was rolled out by the Bush administration as something to focus on Palestinian institution building. Later this summer, there's rumors that we're going to have some agreement on principles or framework or parameters, something, and settlement freeze and all kinds of other things are up in the air. And then we get to Annapolis, and there's a joint understanding, a very short document read by the president, and the purpose of the meeting seemed to bounce all around like in a pinball machine. It's obviously probably not the most effective way to lead up to such a. It was really powerful a series of events this week. No new ground was broken. We read the documents, we read the speeches. Very little. And in some senses, you almost get depressed. I don't know. I wasn't drafting the agreement, but I imagine that those core issues that Israelis and Palestinians are supposed to be focusing on, the ones we all know, the laundry list, I imagine they weren't in the understanding because there was no agreement to put them in there. And it's kind of sad because I think about 15 years ago on the White House lawn, it's a long time ago, the parties were courageous enough to just mention those 5 or 6 words. And then you ask about what lessons we learned. Well, I think lessons are being drawn, and it's clear. You actually read them. Excuse me, I'm also suffering from a cold. People are drawing lessons from the past, and the Bush administration is. Unfortunately, they've drawn some of the wrong lessons on major issues, like the fundamental role of the United States in a conflict such as this, where one of the parties is such a close ally of ours, where the asymmetries of power are so pronounced, and where we have such a huge investment. This is not just something that we're coming around to today. We've got a huge investment in Arab-Israeli peacemaking that we need to protect. So the fundamental shape and the requirements of the American role, I think some of the wrong lessons are being drawn, even on very small tactical issues, how you use the summit. I'm not sure if you stack this meeting up with other meetings and you compare how they either launched processes where there were procedural and other breakthroughs, or they were the culmination of consummation of agreements. But that being said, there was some good news too. And I'll add a little bit to what Ed said and offer a couple other issues as well. This president, who has not talked very much about why Arab-Israeli peacemaking is important, did that in his speech. He would just point to, again, what the goals were. He's been talking about the goals the last few years, all the way back to around the time of 9/11, but he explained why it's so important. He didn't tell us how we're going to get there. Some of us were looking for that, but that's okay. I think that's important. He showed that he's committed, and the president and particularly the Secretary of State, they've kind of gone on a limb now. And if for no other reason, you can expect something might get accomplished in the next months and in this next year. The regional alignment that they spoke to, you don't have to look that far back. It's just earlier this year, January, February, Damascus, Mecca, everyone's competing. Who can broker a Hamas, a Fatah unity government? The U.S., Condoleezza Rice is visiting the region. No, that's the wrong step to make. She's in Egypt saying, don't do it. And then they're all running between Damascus. Everybody was all over the map. And here, there's much more alignment now. We found a way to bring regional stakeholders in a way that aligns regional diplomacy. And there's no doubt we can get a lot more done with this alignment. And then there was the commitment, or I should say there was a restating of the American commitment to monitor how each side implements what they've agreed to. What have they agreed to? It's not that clear, actually, from Annapolis. But again, we've come back to it. Here's one of the lessons, I think, one of the right lessons that is being learned from history is that the American role doesn't involve monitoring and monitoring of consequences. Everything's going to fall apart. Everything's going to unravel. And in this book that Phil mentioned that I worked on with Ambassador Dan Kritzer, we sat for 9 months and we interviewed all the former negotiators, people from all sides. There were very few common lessons that people point to, but this one was something that was unanimous among everyone. Everyone pointed, and even some of the negotiators who were critical of their own role, pointed to the fact that part of the American role is not just to facilitate, it's not just to underwrite agreements, it's not just to sometimes bring them to the table and have the photo opportunities, but it's to do a really strong, vigorous monitoring role where there's consequences involved. And there's a general that's been named, or a prominent person, and I have some hopes for that. And in fact, I was I had the opportunity to speak with the secretary about a week or two ago, and we talked about this very issue. And you know, I could tell from our conversation she understood. She drew, I think, the right lesson. Now we have to sort of wait and see how we're going to do it, and the devil's in the details.
Thank you, Scott. Greg Khalil, there's a huge gap between the realities on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza and the lofty goals announced at Annapolis. Could you comment on that, how that situation could be transformed? How do you see the negotiations and the American role? Are these to be, as the American spokesman has said, bilateral negotiations, or will there be strong American leadership, either through mediation or something going beyond mediation? And what would the Palestinians like to see at the beginning and as the process proceeds?
Well, I hate to be the Cassandra, but I will follow Scott's lead and start with the bad news, because you did raise sort of the facts on the ground. First of all, I do want to say that overall Annapolis should be viewed as a positive moment, but if we're going to look at the facts on the ground, there are a few new things during the past 7 years. And one of the largest, at least on the Palestinian side, is the fact that there are 100,000 new settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So that's a 30% plus increase of settlers, which will naturally make the implementation of any agreement much more difficult. Some other sort of interesting facts are the increase in restrictions on Palestinian movement, such that Palestinians can't effectively move or trade within their own towns or villages. There are 50% more roadblocks and restrictions on movement for Palestinians in just the last 2 years alone, and we're hoping some of those will be eased. Now, those are very, very difficult obstacles to deal with, just as the divide between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is. We're not ignoring that. I don't think anyone up here would say for 1 second that there are not some realities, that certain realities on the ground don't exist that may be seemingly intractable. I want to say, however, that the Annapolis process can be viewed and should be viewed in positive terms for many of the reasons that Faith already mentioned. I think Ambassador Wilcox hinted at another role. One thing that we've learned is that, well, a lot of the issues ultimately, actually all of the issues ultimately are Palestinians and Israelis' duty to resolve. There are issues, but we've also learned over these past few years that we can't do it alone. And so having an engaged secretary there, having a president who's saying, look, we're not going to tell you what to do in the negotiations room, but rather we're going to bring together the political consensus and the political will is a key positive point about this entire process. Now, I just, can I say one other thing about that, alternating back to some of the bad and the good news? I think that, you know, you started the question about facts, or ended the question about facts on the ground, rather, asking, well, okay, what is the situation and can it be resolved, and how can it be resolved through negotiations? First, I'd like to say that it's incredibly important to resolve the issue if we're looking more broadly in regional terms. For example, if you take the issue of the restrictions of movement on Palestinians, what we saw during the last couple of years, politically, not just in humanitarian terms, was the fact that first, the restrictions on movement meant that the majority of Palestinians, according to the World Bank, according to the United Nations, all these international organizations, live in poverty. Now what we have with the reinstitution of the peace process and the reinvigoration of what proves to be a very positive process is the result that all of these new monies are coming back into the territories. I don't know if a lot of you are aware, but during the year of the embargo against the Hamas-led PA, we had a drop in GDP that was expected of nearly 10%. But during that same period, international aid to the Palestinian territories didn't decrease, it actually increased by nearly 300%. So the fear going forward, what we're looking for the day after is not just this new political process, but some substantive change on the ground. because obviously this is a terrible humanitarian situation, but if we're looking forward just in the next few months, and we have all of this money coming in, again, which is necessary to change the political dynamics on the ground. If Palestinians can't move between their villages, if they can't trade, if they can't have real jobs, just get sacks of flour to sort of feed their family for a few more weeks, the situation that we'll have is we'll have all of these potential spoilers saying, look, $400 million new dollars in the last 4 months. Do you see any of it in your daily lives? Can you move in your village? No, the only people who benefit from this are the so-called moderates who are out there trying to negotiate a two-state solution that's going to work for both Israelis and Palestinians. So I think this gets back to Nate's point about seeing the potential now for a convergent process between the improvement on the ground and the political process. Now, is that possible? I think it absolutely is possible, but perhaps I'll save that comment for another intervention.
Thank you, Greg, and welcome, Daniel. Let me ask you, Daniel, the administration's spokesman, including Stephen Hadley, has emphasized that this is a bilateral process and that the United States is not going to offer its own policy views to inform these negotiations. We've seen during the last 3 months a series of meetings between Prime Minister Olmert and President Abbas in an effort to first create a declaration of principles, which they were unable to do, and then to draft a statement of what their task would be. Even in the latter, more modest assignment, they couldn't agree on an agenda or a definition of what issues are to be negotiated. Are we to expect then that as the negotiations begin in 2 weeks, that there will be an agreed agenda on the issues to be discussed and a willingness to discuss them, or is something else going to have to happen if these major final status issues of settlements, borders, Jerusalem, refugees, and security, which must be negotiated, will be addressed?
Aluf Ben has an interesting piece in today's Haaretz, which is only Bush can. And that really would get at the heart of what you just said, Phil. I'd first like to apologize for my lateness. I had the time wrong. And is this a horrible echo, or are people hearing okay?
Right.
Daniel, may I interrupt a moment? There's room on the floor if anybody wants to sit on the floor up here. Excuse me.
No. Let me also say how honored I am to be at something which has all those banners on the side. I wrote recently in the Herald Tribune about a coalition of sanity, and for me, APN, Brit Tzedek, IPF, AAI, ATFP, and Churches for Middle East Peace is precisely that. I'm very honored that those groups have given us this platform and come together. No, I think the headlines for Annapolis are US engagement good, back to negotiations good, flipping the roadmap logic good. The roadmap logic was no permanent status negotiations until we've done A, B, C, D, E, F, G, which is all outlined in the roadmap. So the very fact that they're committed to permanent status negotiations, that we even have to ask these questions in advance of December 12th, I think that's a crucial change. If anything, that's the most important change. I would also say the skepticism here in the Arab world, in Israel, is absolutely understandable and very well earned by this administration. You pay a price for 7 years of neglect. When you come to the table, people, where have you been, guys? And so I think that record is well earned. It's, in an objective way, difficult to see this as a new opportunity. The opportunity is the fact of American engagement. In the region, people may say 2002, Saudi initiative, opportunity. Abu Mazen replacing Arafat, opportunity. Olmert replacing Sharon and getting elected, opportunity. Palestinian unity government, opportunity. This opportunity, because I think Olmert and Abbas would have been talking anyway, this opportunity is of America's making, and therefore that puts more onus on the US side. Not that we don't have responsibilities of our own. My answer to the question you posed, Phil, And I was thinking how to approach this. My answer would be, read the chapter in Glenn Kessler's book on Secretary Rice, The Confidant, about the Lebanon War. And for me, there are 3 lessons about Condi Rice in war that have to be learned in order for her and the administration to be effective in peace. And those 3 lessons are, first of all, treat local divisions in fragile Arab political entities with great caution. Don't try to exacerbate those divisions as a recipe for stability. That was Lebanon in the summer of 2006. It was about driving home a Lebanese division as a way of creating new Lebanese stability. And we may well see that coming full circle in the next week if they manage to agree over a presidential candidate in Lebanon, probably Michel Suleiman. And that's what I'd say is the first lesson you have to learn. Don't use this process as a way of exacerbating Palestinian division. And I know that those who've heard me before are probably bored of listening to me make this Hamas point. So let me just put it as succinctly as I can. 4 points why it's important. Number 1, a real threat to this process is Hamas violence. But I think 2, 3, and 4 are even more important. Number 2 is if there is an escalation, and it can be at a moment's notice, that a Qassam rocket causes a terrible tragedy, more than has happened so far in one of Israel's southern towns. Continued escalation and non-ceasefire on Israel's southern border with Gaza poses a great threat to the morning after Annapolis, because if Israel is back in the Gaza Strip with the attendant destruction and cause of losses for the Palestinian civilian population, then our good friend President Abbas will be in an impossible situation to be sitting down with his Israeli counterpart. Third reason, the legitimacy and credibility of this process on the Palestinian and Arab side is undermined by the absence of Hamas. We tend to think of the two-state solution as all gain and no pain for the Palestinians. My argument would be that if we try and do this, and the agreement is judged not only on its merit, but also because you're trying to win an internal Palestinian political fight, you undermine the agreement, and that you will need, eventually, Palestinian reunification of a body politic to implement the agreement. And when you read the joint statement, implementation is dependent on Palestinian capacity. I don't see how you get that capacity without putting the sides together. The second thing from the summer of '06 is about American leadership. And it needs to be early and often, not late and fleeting. Read the chapter on Lebanon in Glenn's book. The administration waited and waited and then waited. On day 34, you had a UN resolution. This time, we're going to have to see very different American leadership, and that's why I think you'll need bridging proposals. Leadership in at least 2 ways. One, babysitting. I'm kind of tempted to say, don't poo-poo babysitting. Doing the day-to-day work on roadmap implementation requires a degree of American engagement that we have not heretofore seen. And the second is do more than what you just said, Phil. Do more than support the bilateral process. At certain times you will have to intervene to help both sides. Leadership, by the way, is not soloism. One of the things that worried me at Annapolis is the quartet, which has been a pretty lackluster mechanism, seemed to disappear. All the monitoring will be exclusively American. Don't go solo again. Use the quartet and use the Arab group. And my final point here, which I have to say, having read this morning's Haaretz preview of an interview with the Israeli Prime Minister, is help Israel come down from ladders. Don't push us further up ladders. And that's what happened in the summer of '06 as well. Rather than saying to the Israelis, you're right, it was an unprovoked act of Hezbollah aggression, you have every right to strike back and defend yourself, and now on day 3, you hit them hard and we have to turn to diplomacy. When the Israeli Prime Minister And this is an Israeli journalist who, of course, wasn't in the room, but he gave me such a colorful description, I want to share it. Of imagining the Israeli Prime Minister on the phone to Washington, and he's saying, well, we need more time, Madam Secretary. Yes, we know. And you know that means that we're going to have to escalate our aggression, and there are going to be consequences for Lebanon, but we need that time. Yes, we know. And the Israeli Prime Minister is saying, where's my exit strategy? And if you read closely the testimonies of Foreign Minister Livni, Defense Minister Peretz, Public Security Minister Dichter, and others, at the Visegrad Commission, then you see an Israel that assumed, when it took that fateful decision to launch a strike, that assumed we had 24, 48, 72 hours, and then it was going to switch to diplomacy. But rather than bring us down a ladder, we were encouraged up a ladder, and that brings me to this morning's interview. I don't know what else Ehud Olmert has to say without saying, force me to do it. This wasn't Ori Nir or Daniel Levy saying, either we have a two-state solution or Israel is finished. This was the Israeli Prime Minister saying that.
It was not even Jimmy Carter saying that.
Thank you. One comment, because of the day that we're holding this meeting on, which is the 29th of November. 29th of November 1947 is the great moment of international recognition for Zionism. It's UN Resolution 181. It's a division of mandatory Palestine into 55% for a Jewish national home, 45% for a Palestinian Arab state. What Annapolis represented more than anything else with the Arab presence was the Arab world saying, you've gotten to yes. And the yes you've gotten to is not the yes of 60 years ago, of a Jewish national home on 55%. You've gotten to a yes on 78%. That's the message. And I think the question Ehud Olmert asked all of us, Israelis, Americans, and friends of Israel in America, is will we suffice with 78%, or will we fight for decades and decades in order to get to, maybe 80%? That's the A to Z of Annapolis. From Annapolis to Zionism is recognizing the link to 60 years ago and saying yes to 78%, and for that we will probably need American leadership. I'm not sure if this administration can provide it. I'd love to be proved wrong.
Thank you, Daniel. There are several questions about the implementation and monitoring mechanisms that have been discussed, announced at Annapolis. We read in the press that the administration has appointed General James Jones, a retired U.S. Army general, as our Middle East envoy for security. I don't know if what his functions will be. I don't know if they envisage that he might also monitor the other imperative in the roadmap, which is a freeze on Israeli settlement expansion. Ori Nir, could you discuss what is needed by way of effective monitoring mechanisms on both the issues of security and settlements? What is a freeze on settlements? We hear so much about a freeze. How should that be defined if it's going to be effective and helpful? And is there a notion among some that a freeze and an end to current settlement development will be the end of the settlement issue, or must this process envisage a very major evacuation of settlements in a next phase?
Thank you, Phil. Before I do that, I'd like to, just in a nutshell, because we're in the business of accentuating the positive here, at least I hope, one quick comment about a consequence, maybe an unintended one, but a very positive one, I think, of Annapolis, and that is a certain detente and maybe even movement on the Israeli-Syrian track. Something is going on there, clearly, and that's a good thing. It had a lot to do with Syria's attending the conference, and perhaps even speaking, we don't know exactly what happened in the closed session, which was devoted to the Arab issue. Regarding settlements, this will be Olmert's big challenge, biggest challenge for sure, without a doubt. There are two issues that are demanded in the first phase of the roadmap. One is the freeze on settlements, and the other on settlement construction, and the other is the dismantlement of illegal outposts, so the settlement outposts in the West Bank. Both will be very difficult. Outposts may be even more difficult because although those are illegal outposts and most Israelis recognize that and support their removal, that requires actual action. That requires action on behalf of the Israeli government, and there will be clashes, and it will look bad, and it may even rally a great deal of support for the settlers and galvanize the settlers to increase their influence in the Israeli public. What does freeze on settlement mean? Well, it can mean various things, and it was never clearly defined in the roadmap. The way Olmert defined it, apparently, reportedly, a week ago or so in the cabinet meeting, was no new settlements. No new settlements is not news, and clearly that's not what is meant by a freeze on settlement. What the freeze on settlements apparently means is no building, no construction in settlements at all, including, as the roadmap says, including natural growth. There was a time when the former Prime Minister Rabin actually canceled existing tenders and stopped ongoing activity, ongoing settlement activity, ongoing construction activity in settlements, and paid back the people who were engaged in the construction there. I don't know if that will be done here, but that would be going a step further. He compensated the builders. Again, this will be Olmert's big challenge. Hard for me to see at the moment how he can engage in this forthright immediately and start with a real campaign of removing outposts. But in order for the first phase of the roadmap to be fulfilled, he must do it.
Greg, very quickly, is some visible, tangible movement on a settlement freeze kind of litmus test in the eyes of the Palestinian public?
Well, as Ori mentioned, there are a number of components to settlement freeze, but I think the most obvious one would be construction. Are there bulldozers operating in the settlements? And right now, you drive around the West Bank, you drive around East Jerusalem, on the outskirts of East Jerusalem, there's tons of cranes, and I haven't been there in several weeks, but last time I was there before there was talk of a settlement freeze, there was quite a lot of activity there. That said, I think there are so many components to the settlement enterprise that, you know, sometimes we look again at some of these very, very difficult issues and think that they are impossible to solve. Well, you know, if you go through sort of all the components of why there are settlements there and how they continue to grow, you see that there are a number of incentives for settlers to live out there. There's a connection to to a lot of Western corporations and whatnot, and I don't want to get into any issues related to economics of it or whatnot, because at the end of the day, it is a question of political will. And I think that by providing the framework for a credible political process that's endorsed by the entire Arab world, and something we didn't even mention, but Malaysia and Indonesia and Islamic states were there as well yesterday, which is not insignificant. They are also endorsing a political document, a political initiative, the Arab Peace Initiative, that we have the framework or the ability to create the political momentum to address the settlement question. And thankfully, most settlers who are living in the settlements are not there, as I think Ori would agree, for ideological reasons, but just because it makes economic sense. So there's a number of ways to deal with this in a practical way that you're not going to have Gaza disengagement repeat of, you know, these very dramatized scenes, but rather a calm and reasonable approach to creating a viable state for Palestinians and a secure state for Israel.
Greg, I hear you saying that a settlement freeze is more than just a simple stroke of the pen exercise. I have many questions on the Arab world's role in this process. The Saudi initiative, the Beirut Declaration, and the importance of Syria in this complex of issues. Prince Saud said it is essential that the Syrian-Israeli dimension be dealt with as well. We read in the paper this morning that the Russians have offered their assistance in hosting a meeting in Moscow in which this issue will be featured. Is it possible to create a process in which there is either a parallel or sequential treatment of the Israeli-Syrian territorial conflict? Should the U.S. support this? What are the views of Palestinians and Israelis? Ray, could you address that?
If I can first just address a few points that were raised by the previous speakers very quickly. I mean, one of the things, settlements and things on the ground are very important. Issues of quality of life, issues of security for Israelis are very important. However, my concern, and I saw a bit of this in the previous few minutes, is this becomes the focus of attention. Okay? Ultimately, these things are important because they will help us reach a permanent deal and a two-state solution. If these issues, the issues on the ground, become the focus of attention, political capital starts being spent on these issues, then I think we're going down a negative route. And that's why, in some ways, the role of the Americans, the role of the administration here, the diplomacy, is very important. These issues should not become a forum for, finger pointing and for assigning blame. The role of the Americans will be to facilitate, to ensure the parties continue to focus on the main issues. The role of the U.S. is essential for this. The U.S. is the only country that can bring the necessary diplomatic, security, and financial resources to move the process forward. And one trend that I've seen in the last few days, we're here in the middle of an election year, presidential election year, with an administration that's not very popular with many. And I see quite a few remarks which are willing to dismiss the whole progress and the whole process as a way, either as a knee-jerk reaction against the administration or as a way you're basically positioning for the elections. For us in the region, this will be extremely unhelpful. I think we see some seriousness, some problems, some mistakes, but some seriousness made by the administration. This should be pushed. Back to your question about Syria. Actually, I think theoretically it's possible to have two parallel tracks we've had in the past, but I will have two caveats here. The first caveat is in the past we've always seen the two tracks, Syrian Israeli and Palestinian Israeli, being played off against one another. You use the Syrian track as an excuse to kind of remove rubbish from the Palestinian and vice versa. We should not play these games again. If we move on the two tracks, they have to be done with the same amount of investment in both. This again requires a level of leadership from the United States. But as important, to be honest, I don't see immediate progress happening with the Syrian track anytime soon. And I don't want to see the Palestinian-Israeli track being held hostage to that. Meaning, the Syrian track, while theoretically it's a simple one, it's only a territorial issue around the Golan in abstract. In reality, it's a much more complicated issue. The Syrian track involves issues related to Lebanon, Syria's war in Lebanon, involves issues relating to the tribunal of the assassination of former Prime Minister Hariri, includes the Syrian relation with Iran, includes the Syrian role in Iraq. And so, getting into a Syrian process will require such an expenditure of political capital, particularly in this country, in the US, that I don't see it happening anytime soon. What I do not want, and I hope that the Arab nations also understand this, that the Palestinian track gets held back until all of these issues that are connected to the Syrian track are resolved. Ultimately, the comprehensive peace is a precondition for comprehensive and full normalization to Arab world in Israel, but we can move on with the peace process, we can move on with gradual degrees of normalization in Arab countries and Israel, and let the Syrian track and let the Syrian issue take its time and mature in a natural way.
Let me turn back to Hamas, which several of you have mentioned. Is it a sound policy to maintain very draconian pressures against the Gazan populace while a Palestinian-Israeli peace process begins, would it be desirable to move quickly to try to address the humanitarian issue in Gaza beyond providing mere life support? And on the problem of the divided Palestinian community, how can the president of Palestine negotiate effectively without some kind of reconciliation between the two sides? And should the Arab world, the Western world, the United States, and the State of Israel alter their policies and encourage internal Palestinian and reconciliation? If so, when and how? And will they find an open door among the Hamas leadership if they press them to become a legitimate and responsible player and partner in the process? Daniel.
Well, I should probably hand over to Ray, because I think we have different, partly different perspectives on this.
Why don't you offer yours briefly and then we'll turn to Grace.
Fine. I just feel I did, and I know we're not on the time. No, you can't do this on the basis of a divided Palestinian polity. I think, well, first of all, I at least want to get a very clear statement out there. You do not punish a civilian population of 1.4 million people. And not only because you're applauding me for the humanitarian position I've taken, I think, and I do come to this from the humanitarian position, but it's also self-defeating. It's secondary as a human being, but it's important. It's self-defeating. Our populations are not punished into liking the people who punish them. If we haven't got that into our skulls, we really should not be doing this.
Ray, how would you...
Just one more comment on this, Phil. The Saudi foreign minister said something interesting while he was in Washington in his briefing to the press here. The Saudi foreign minister said, you can't do this with a divided Palestinian side, you're going to have to bring Hamas in. My argument would be twofold. One, allow the Arab states, other parties, to begin to send out feelers, to begin to see how you get past this divided Palestinian polity. I'm not saying that Abbas tomorrow has to sit down with them, or America or Israel, but rather than saying, don't you dare even try to bring them in, we should be quietly saying, do everything to bring them in, and secondly, try and get a ceasefire between Gaza and Israel.
Ray, how do you get to Palestinian reconciliation and when, and is it possible?
First of all, I would just, again, reaffirm what Daniel said. The humanitarian punishment of Gaza itself is not a sound policy. I would go a step further, and I would caution against a policy that would cause the collapse of the economy in Gaza. It's not only a humanitarian issue, it's an economic issue. If the economy collapses, the private sector collapses, it will be very hard to rebuild it. On Hamas, Fatah, how do you get there? I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon, to be honest. There's no appetite on Abbas's side, and there's definitely no appetite on Hamas's side. There is, what the relationship between Hamas and Fatah right now is a power struggle with many dimensions. Political, ideological, approach to foreign policy, approach to domestic policy, and unfortunately after the takeover of Gaza has become too far right now to reconcile. And right now, politically speaking, any dialogue that Abbas has with Hamas at this stage would be one that he will lose politically from, and Hamas will push his advantage on. There isn't appetite among the Arab world as well to bring in Hamas to the game after what happened in Gaza. The fact that all the Arab states were there, the fact that Syria was there, the fact that Syria cancelled the Hamas or counter Annapolis, there was a conference of the rejectionist parties that was scheduled in Damascus, and Damascus cancelled them. The fact that right now Hamas' only immediate supporter in the region is Iran, which actually Hamas are paying the price for. All of itself shows that we're not there yet at the moment where Hamas and Fatah have to can get together. Now, there have been certain conditions. I mean, or actually, let me take a step back. I don't believe ultimately a peace deal is doable without the Islamist constituency in Palestine. It's a real constituency that cannot be wished away. And Hamas right now is a result of that constituency. But there have been certain conditions for Hamas to get in, not only the international conditions, but internal conditions put by President Abbas. I think part of Abbas's calculation, he enters into Annapolis, enters into the peace process, hoping that success in the peace process will strengthen him politically and allow him then to move into a reconciliation process with Hamas on his terms. And this is what's important. When Abbas sees that it's the right moment, on terms that he believes are acceptable, then the international community should not play spoiler roles. If Abbas believes that we can move to a situation where Hamas will support the peace process and end violence, then we should not have the US, the Quartet, and Israel for our ideological region block us. This is a domestic political issue. Let's play it in our domestic political way. And outside intervention might not be very helpful here.
Scott Lozeski, how would you deal with Hamas? What is the linkage between Hamas and Syria in this complex? And could you give us your thoughts on how to address the Syrian-Israeli conflict?
Thanks, Phil. Now, maybe I'll be the one guy in Washington to say sometimes I don't know the answer. The Hamas dimension in the process is really very, very difficult. And in past Arab-Israeli episodes of peacemaking, the U.S. has often encountered rejectionists, either within the political sphere or on the outside. I mean, this isn't new, but it's a lot harder now. This is much harder than in the 70s when Palestinian rejectionist groups were operating throughout the diaspora. This is very different, mainly because the division is geographic and not just political. In fact, my comment to what the other panelists said is I would be more concerned as an American negotiator with trying to mitigate the dimensions of the geographic division and trying to push as hard as you can on the access issue, which for the most part affects average Palestinians, it's not the political divide, than to try to get involved either as a spoiler or a veto actor or as a promoter of unity. Because at the end of the day, the future of the Palestinian national movement, which is really what's up for grabs here, is not something that the United States is going to determine. That's for Palestinians to determine. What we do is going to have a big impact on it, and particularly Israel and all the actors, but it's really a choice for Palestinians. Hamas remains, it's a very dangerous, not just a political movement, but it remains a very dangerous threat to Palestinians, but particularly to Israel. And I think we have to have clear red lines. Now, where I would differ from the diplomacy of earlier last year, is that I think the script that the U.S. and the international community needs to give to Hamas, whether they're representing the Palestinian government or whether they're outside the government, needs to be a kind of a dynamic script that's being updated. And you have version 1.1 and then 2.1 and then 2.2, and you have to be constantly giving them a sense of what they need to do and standards to meet. So I would promote, maybe to some from California, I don't know, a more dynamic Southern California. You need to give them a better script. They may fail the test, but you should always be tested. And then second, and we're not doing it now, but I was worried, I think we were doing it a little bit last year, we shouldn't be promoting civil war between Palestinian factions. There were a lot of hard questions asked, I don't know about in this room, but on the Hill about the U.S. security assistance package that was developed for Palestinians in 2005-6, and I think the amounts were actually reduced. And I think the right kind of questions were asked here on the Hill, which is, should the U.S. really be gearing itself up to be backing one side over another in what became a civil war? And in some respects, we could have even prompted the takeover in June. The one thing that's, and it was already mentioned, but we should remind ourselves, Annapolis, having everybody lining up and having the Syrians there. It's important. Sometimes our diplomacy, you can't get all the rejectionists in the room. It's not that easy. And sometimes you have to do diplomacy, as Yitzhak Rabin used to say. We're going to fight against the rejectionists on one hand as if there's no peace being made, and we're going to work on the peace as if the rejectionists and the violence isn't there. We can't always hope to get them in the tent, but what we can do, and I think we can try to be as clever as we can, is to try to make it hard for them. You don't want the rejectionists, you don't want to make it easy to have them all lined up and have Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and Iran and Syria all together under their own tent, sort of laughing at us. If they want to run back and forth between the tents, let them. If we bring the Syrians to Annapolis and that, sort of Tehran gets PO'd, that's a good thing. And we should try to do more things like that. That's a great stuff. And it doesn't mean that I think Syrian-Israeli negotiations are going to start tomorrow. They're not. And that's quickly to answer your other question, Phil. At this point, the challenge for the U.S. Is, I think, to find ways to test Syrian intentions and to test Israeli willingness to negotiate. It's not to actually try to move them toward an official, formal process like Israelis and Palestinians are now into, but a series of tests, and that's going to involve diplomacy behind the scenes. And in many respects, it's very much aligned with the gradual, though it's very clear, the gradual shift in the U.S. approach towards Syria since the Iraq Study Group report, Baker Hamilton, sitting with them at the Iraq and its neighbors' foreign ministers meetings. Now they were at Annapolis. I think you're seeing a gradual, I'd like to see it maybe a little bit further, but I think there's a gradual return to a pragmatic sort of approach to the Syrians. And one thing I would say, as we do that, I think there's a sense, and I'm not concerned about the Bush administration, there's not going to be a trade-off with Lebanon here. That's not, I don't think that's part of what we're trying to do. But also as a sort of a point to reassure skeptics of re-engaging with the Syrians, our diplomacy isn't going to somehow insulate them further and extend the life expectancy of this regime. This regime has actually cracked down and consolidated power in some very significant ways, actually in a period where we were trying to isolate and undermine the regime. So I wouldn't be concerned that sort of tough, cautious engagement on Arab-Israeli issues or on Iraq is somehow going to give another 20 years in office, because it's not. And it actually might give us a small wedge to get in and talk about issues that will actually make it harder for them in the long term, reform and corruption and the like.
Before we leave the Gaza-Hamas issue, should the United States press for implementation of the, I believe it's called the Trade and Access Agreement, Access and Movement Agreement that Condoleezza Rice negotiated 2 years ago with the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. The situation has changed now because there is no Palestinian partner that can act for Gaza. Nevertheless, could a way be found to do that? Would that be a rapid and desirable way to begin to relieve the suffering in Gaza?
I think because this involves Tony Blair, I think Daniel should talk about no, I'm just joking. But that's actually the one element none of us have talked about, because if I can add, and maybe one way, I don't know who in here, which offices everybody represents, but I sit here and it feels like a hearing room. Probably is a hearing room. If I was here, if I was a member of Congress and I was questioning Secretary Rice or David Wells, the Assistant Secretary, or any of our experts or veteran negotiators in this room, I would try to sum up a lot of the things that we've talked about and probe them very hard on 3 levels. Because essentially, nothing's going to come from Annapolis if there's not simultaneous progress on 3 levels. The first is on the ground, and that's what Phil was asking about. Finding ways, some of them are going to be quiet, but they have to be quite determined to improve things on the ground. For Palestinians, it's pushing hard on the institution building, but it's also giving them something on access and movement. And you have to find a way, and a lot of that has to do with the Blair mission. For Israelis, it's having very difficult conversations about where the wall is being built, where the separation barrier is going, and about and some very positive conversations, and also finding ways to help them out on the security issue. And making sure the security issue is front and center. But as we're working on the ground, there has to be concerted effort at the negotiating table. That's the second level. And a lot of that is what Annapolis is about. And at the same time, there needs to be action at the regional level. It's very much a 3-tiered process. And I think any time our negotiators are in the room, or our foreign negotiators are here trying to give advice, we should be asking and pushing and making sure that they're working simultaneously on all 3 levels. Because if one gets neglected, the whole house of cards is going to fall down.
2 comments. First, I want to echo something Ray said. The value of Annapolis may well be in its appreciation of the fact that we can't go very far with Roadmap Phase 1. Roadmap Phase 1, at best, provides an oxygen tank to the political negotiations. The lesson of the last 15 years and of the last 4.5 years since we put the roadmap out there is this conflict does not lend itself to gradual confidence building, incremental measures under conditions of occupation and by extension no security for Israelis. The second point is I fear that we're kidding ourselves. I fear that this is all set up according to the following equation. The Israelis do A, B, C, D, outpost settlements, easing of closure, because that's what the Palestinians need. and the Palestinians do security. And this is the most difficult challenge, but I think we have to break out of that framing, because I'm not saying that we shouldn't do the maximum to provide security, but the fundamental equation that I think is misguided is that an occupied people provides security to its occupiers and to their settler population. I'm not sure we could find an example in history where that works and where the leadership of the occupied people who are playing that role maintain their domestic credibility. I was stunned by the fact that someone like Yossi Alpha wrote a piece where he said, if you push too far on this security issue, you turn the PA security forces into lahads. There was an Israeli proxy army in South Lebanon called the South Lebanese Army under Antoine Lahad. We don't want Abbas's people to be playing that role. And I think it's the most difficult thing. We can pay lip service. You can set up that framing as long as you don't really believe it's doable. Because if you believe it's doable, you're somehow imposing an impossible precondition. The Palestinians can deliver security under sovereignty or independence. They can deliver efforts that will be wildly imperfect and will be combined with violent resistance from some parts under conditions of occupation. And so I just caution us against allowing this misframing to continue to guide all our thinking.
There's a question about the internal conflict in Israel and whether David or any Israeli prime minister can overcome this because of the depth of the division. If there are final status negotiations which begin to make progress, will this promote political upheaval in Israel, even civil war by militant settler elements? We also hear that public opinion polls repeatedly show that the majority of the Israeli public wants peace and is ready to make very forthcoming compromises on all the big issues, settlements, Jerusalem included. Ori, please comment on this, and Daniel's comment that Prime Minister Olmert would be supported and strengthened by strong American leadership and an American push and willingness, in contrast to the past, to say no sometimes.
President Abbas said something very true, I think, in his speech, which is that public opinion is maybe the most important component in all this. And he was talking mainly about Israeli public opinion. Very true. How do you deal with Israeli public opinion? How do you deal with a population that is extremely cynical, skeptical, that very much wants peace, wants a two-state solution, but frankly doesn't want to pay the price, neither in the West Bank nor with Syria. There's a great support for peace with Syria. However, when you ask, are you willing to for Israel to withdraw from the Golan Heights, the answer is the majority say no. And I think that there are smart ways of doing that. It has to be incremental, it has to be done trilaterally between Israel, the United States, and the Palestinians. Ways could be found to convince Israelis that that is the right way, that is the only way. Again, to reiterate something that Daniel said earlier, this interview, this quote, the amazing quote that Olmert gave yesterday to Haaretz, saying that if a two-state solution is not achieved, Israel is doomed. And not only doomed, he said that's it. There's no more Israel. Why? Because the alternative is for us to become South Africa. And he continued to say, we will become South Africa, and the first supporters we will lose will be American Jews who would not be willing to put up with it. I think that that's a beginning for a prime minister who hopefully has the guts and has the hopefully in the future the public support to lead such a momentous undertaking. Measures could be made by Palestinians, should be made by Palestinians and by the United States as well. The U.S. should assume a role in that as well. And the Palestinians can provide their own. Again, I thought we saw a few very interesting, very intriguing, and maybe promising such hints in Mahmoud Abbas's speech. And we saw, by the way, reciprocally, in Olmert's speech, such little hints of acknowledgement, for instance, of the Palestinian pain of 1948. Israeli leaders usually refrain from touching the issue of opening, we call it opening the files of 1948. Prime Minister Olmert, in his speech, talked about that specifically, which I thought I've never heard an Israeli leader talk about it in such a public forum. The idea would be to gradually, so maybe we're talking about not a two-track process here, but maybe a three-track process of negotiating about the final settlement, regardless of what happens on the ground. That is where America's role would be. I'll make just a quick comment. Yesterday, Prime Minister Olmert briefed Israeli reporters, and he said, to me, the most important part of the joint declaration is the very bottom of it, which says that there will not be an implementation of an agreement reached by the end of 2008 unless all the requirements of the first phase of the roadmap are fulfilled. I think that what would be extremely important for the United States to do, for the administration to do, is to say, fine, but that linkage does not go the other way. It's not a two-way linkage. In other words, if there are problems on the ground, that does not mean that you stop negotiating on final statement issues, which is something that both Leith and Daniel pointed out earlier. The third track here would be the, you can call it public diplomacy, you can call it addressing public opinion, various gestures that all sides can take in order to try to reduce the extreme level of cynicism that has reached a level of animosity among Israelis and Palestinians.
Thank you. Greg, public opinion is no less important to the Palestinian leadership. We read in the press that there have been demonstrations against Annapolis, a lot of negative commentary from the Palestinian politicians, deep skepticism from the public. Would the Palestinian public rally to more forthcoming American leadership, willingness of the United States to address special issues which are at the moment too sensitive for Israeli and Palestinian leaders to confront, open files which they know must be open, which they're reluctant to open themselves? How will the Palestinians respond to more forceful and explicit American leadership on these various issues, including the issue of Palestinian refugees and the right of return?
Well, I think that Haif raised this when he was saying what was different today from 7 years ago. And many of these issues have been raised and they've been discussed. And we have the Arab Peace Initiative, which the majority of Palestinians support. The majority of Palestinians support, regards even Hamas voters, the majority of Hamas voters support a two-state solution with Israel. And these are important numbers to keep in mind. Because if you look at the Arab Peace Initiative, it talks about a lot of these very difficult, sort of, so to speak, files to open. It says we want a two-state solution with Israel on the 67 lines, not on the lines that the UN recommended 60 years ago today, which were quite different, as Daniel pointed out. So 78% versus 55%. It says that we want a capital in East Jerusalem. It's not talking about the entirety of Jerusalem. And it talks about a just and agreed resolution to the crisis of Palestinian refugees. This is not that Palestinians will sort of compromise on the recognition of the right of every refugee to return to their home regardless of their race, their religion, or their ethnicity, but that within the political framework of a two-state solution that provides a future and stability for both Palestinians and Israelis, that they would be willing to find creative options to implementing that fundamental human right. So when we take that back to the question of public opinion, I look at those polls and I look and I see what's happening, and I see that, I'm not surprised that the majority of Israelis and Palestinians are in fact quite skeptical about a renewed peace process. We've been here before, but if we were to have a real engaged U.S. partner pulling us forward, providing political capital, if we see some improvement on the ground, as Daniel and Faith mentioned, it's not going to happen overnight. That's not, something that I think anyone expects, but if we see tangible improvement within a framework that is showing us that we are moving towards that solution that the majority of Palestinians, Israelis, and even Arabs support, I think that Palestinian public opinion will support not only the end game that we've already defined, but the process as it moves along.
Is Palestinian public opinion hostage to extreme ideological views, or is there a sense of pragmatism and that could support a vigorous peace process in which not only Israelis but Palestinians will be asked to make compromises?
Yeah, I actually agree with many of the points that Greg raised, and I would add here that people are supportive of a negotiated outcome, but Palestinians do not trust that the Israelis are sincere about wanting to reach an agreement of this sort. I'll take it a couple of years back to the elections that Hamas won. Hamas not only won because the PA was corrupt. The main reason why Hamas won, I believe, because people have lost faith in the ability of the moderates to deliver our message. Our message is we can get statehood and liberation through negotiation. We have lost that ability. When Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza, and Hamas spun this as a result of the resistance, there was a very compelling banner that Hamas had in every street in Gaza that said, 3 years of resistance beat 10 years of negotiation. And this resonated. So in many ways, Palestinian public right now doesn't trust the Israelis. Wants to see peace, doesn't trust the Israelis. And this is what we need to see in the next few months. How do we rebuild the trust about sincerity? Two caveats here, or 2 points to add. One is while the Palestinian public is willing to compromise many of the issues, refugees, Jerusalem, and territory, I believe that they're willing to compromise in the context of a package, where you give up a bit on refugees, you get a bit in Jerusalem, you get a bit in territory, where you can have a balanced package. If we try to start playing games, and we saw this in the middle of Annapolis, where we're trying to kind of trick the Palestinians onto giving up on refugees before they get on other things, this won't stand. The only way I believe that we can market an agreement, and all the public opinion polls show that, the only way you market an agreement is through a package approach. And this really brings us to the U.S. role when it comes to issues of substance. I believe the U.S. has to take leadership in terms of designing and driving the process, in terms of injecting energy into the diplomatic process. But when it comes to substance, when it comes to the U.S. presenting substance, I think the U.S. cannot be a replacement for the parties. The parties have to reach, through negotiation, their own understanding of what compromises they need to make. If the U.S. were now to present ideas on the table, I think this would be counterproductive at this moment, because the parties will push back, start attacking these ideas, or start negotiating with the United States as opposed to negotiating with one another. At some point in the future, once we get closer to a deal and once the issues, the differences are clear and identifiable, the U.S. can bring bridging proposal. But at this stage, I think the substance has to be homegrown, but the process has to be driven by the international community.
There are many questions on Iran. The Bush administration has a very crowded Middle East agenda, needless to say. Should it and must it also address the U.S.-Iranian confrontation as one element that complicates the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab peace process? Or is the Iranian issue an intractable one that must be postponed to the future? What do we do about Iran, and in a way that would promote progress between Israel and Palestine, and Israel and Syria? Let me ask you, Uri.
I think it's quite clear that For those of us who support diplomatic engagement as a means to deal with Iran, an Israeli-Palestinian peace process, Israeli-Palestinian peace in the future, hopefully, and engagement with Syria are two extremely important components in devising such a comprehensive diplomacy to deal with the Iranian challenge. So I'm not sure if a diplomatic course of action vis-a-vis Iran would enhance peace efforts with the Palestinians and with Syria, but the other way around definitely is. I'm quite convinced. Yeah.
Should Iran eventually, if it wants to behave constructively, have a place at the larger Middle East table in dealing with and confirming and supporting Israeli-Palestinian peace?
Just had a short comment. I think in general, the role of Iran in the Arab-Israeli realm is exaggerated. It's overemphasized, and we should really be cautious in trying to understand and make judgments about what they are doing, what they can do. But in terms of moving forward after Annapolis, I would be doing exactly what the Bush administration is doing. I think by having a peace process and getting Israelis and Palestinians back to the table, and making sure, as a lot of us emphasized, there's a major regional dimension to that, and that there's an alignment, that you keep the key regional stakeholders aligned together and on the same page, is probably the best and the most we can do right now in terms of Iran vis-a-vis this one issue. But the Iran issue is so much bigger, and I think the main carrots and sticks that we have are really not in the Arab-Israeli realm. They're on the ground in the region, in the Gulf, are a very strong military presence. On the ground in Iraq, I think we're playing tough as they are. And they're responding to it now. I don't think the Green Zone's getting shelled these days. But we're also talking to them. And I hope we continue to talk to them via our ambassador in Baghdad.
Because I think you're right, Scott, that the role is exaggerated. Part of the lesson for me of that is shut up about Iran. Don't frame Annapolis as the anti-Iran summit. I think this will stand or fall in how the Iranians align themselves in regard to this on the merits of Annapolis. If as Annapolis moves forward, this is seen as credible in the Arab world, it's more inclusive, Syria is on board, you begin to overcome the divisions on the Palestinian side, then the Iranians will have less and less to appeal to by being the big naysayers of Annapolis. I think we blow up, we magnify the Iranian hegemonic regional role when we say, you see, we've brought together everyone, and you Iran. So, because if the opposite happens, if the process has little credibility, if there's not improvement on the ground, if other actors aren't brought in, if there's no serious negotiations, the Iranians won't have to do very much in order to benefit from the Annapolis process. I think there's a lot to the argument that says that given the degree to which we have destabilized the Middle East, you might have to be looking at broader grand bargains, including with Iran. And I think it's worth adding that the single most, I would argue, destabilizing thing one could do for the region, for the Israeli-Palestinian process, and many, many other things, would be a preemptive military strike on Iran.
There are several questions on whether or not the United States, given its very close and historic quasi-alliance with Israel, can play the role of an honest broker, a mediator. Is this close relationship compatible with the role that the United States has always aspired to play, but and at some stages has played successfully, but in recent years has failed to play? Anybody like to take that on? I could raise it.
I don't want an honest broker, to be honest. I want an effective broker. Okay? I can get many brokers who... you can get many countries that will come and kind of approach this as a matter of law or justice or right or wrong and what have you. At the end of the day, this will not help me. This will add to the kind of finger-pointing approach to negotiations. The US is the only country that has leverage on Israel, because Israel trusts the US, and therefore the US can move Israel closer to peace, and that's why I want Israel. Now, a point that Daniel mentioned before, though, as the US is indispensable in leading this process, the US shouldn't fly solo, because there are certain points and certain things that other players in the international community could deliver better than the US. The US should be the leader of the process, should help design the rules for the various players, but at the end of the day, without US participation, there will be no progress. Israel will not feel secure enough to move forward.
I can just add too. I mean, what Ed said is so, I think, is so straight on. In the consultation for this book that I wrote with Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, we talked to a lot of Arab leaders and former Arab negotiators. They essentially said the same thing. I mean, why do you think you're so indispensable? Why do you think we deal with you? We do it because you have that special relationship with Israel. We don't want you to compromise it. And sometimes you hear things in rhetoric. At the end of the day, don't believe what you hear, whether it's Amr Moussa talking from the Arab League or whoever. Behind the scenes, the Arab stakeholders are engaged, and they want the U.S. to have a close relationship with Israel. They're not expecting us to be behind this program. They want us to be effective. Another metaphor I was using, not for this book, but in an earlier project, is sometimes it comes down, I don't sound patronizing, but sometimes it comes down to being kind of a big brother. And sometimes having difficult conversations, with the ward, with your partner, and not being a bodyguard, not just sort of being there to add just yet another layer of insulation around Israel. So I think understanding that relationship and having a clear understanding of why Arab parties engage with us on this issue makes it a lot. I think I just had one. This will be very short, though. I didn't get in on the conversation about domestic politics. Something that we came up with in this book project is there's been a clear pattern in the last 20 years or so. American negotiators have overemphasized Israeli domestic politics. We've become over-involved. We're not a member of Israeli government coalitions. And we've systematically been we've underemphasized politics on the Arab side. It's partly because they don't have vibrant, strong democracies. Israel has the strongest democracy in the region, far and away, so we can see a lot. It's transparent. But if there's one thing that negotiators should be aware of, and certainly you've got to be up to speed on what's happening on both sides. Otherwise you'll get tripped up. But be careful not to overemphasize on the one side and not to neglect on the other.
Several people have asked about the demand that some Israelis have voiced recently that there must be, as part of a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine, a recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. I've not heard Prime Minister Olmert himself lay down that marker, but others have. I think this is something new in the repartee. Is it real? Is it serious? Or is this just noise that provocateurs are using?
Someone gave me a cheeky answer to that question, which is that last time I checked, the entry card into being Jewish was circumcision, so circumcise off the West Bank, and then we can make the recognition. But I think that points at an answer, because I think the unhelpful way this was raised in the current round was to make this a precondition. I think there is language that you can find that gives Israelis sufficient satisfaction, but does not force the Palestinians into making a statement regarding the Palestinian Arab minority inside Israel that you could have in the context of a permanent status package. We came up with a form of language in the Geneva Initiative. I think it's doable. It's part of permanent status. And once you have the sensitivity here is Jewish and democratic, and the equal rights for the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, at least in part.
Anybody else like to comment? Ori?
Just one quick thing that I think that at least Prime Minister Olmert is trying to find a padded ladder, if you will, to climb down from that tree. My indication, again, is from this briefing that he had yesterday with Israeli reporters when he was asked about it. He said it's not a precondition. He didn't say that. He didn't say that it's not a precondition for negotiations, but it was very much implied by his answer, which was, we will not reach a treaty with people who do not recognize Israel as a Jewish state. So, no, I don't think that Israel will. I think it's silly. It's really silly to make it a precondition. To make it a part and parcel of a final settlement? Yes.
If I may add, I mean, I agree with my colleagues, but I would just point one thing. I mean, this issue of Israel as a Jewish state only became real, politically speaking, now, the minute that it was uttered. And this is ultimately in the end game in the peace treaty, it will have to be addressed one way or another. But it became significant now because someone did not have the discipline and mentioned it publicly, and suddenly it becomes the focus of politics and of the media and the rest of it. This begs, again, the role of how you manage a political process where everyone will be inclined on both sides to come out and make statements that will be unhelpful. Everyone will be having their public opinions. And this requires, in my view, a strong role for a third party, the US in particular, not in terms of managing the political process. If we had someone, a senior American diplomat, who was present on the ground, who's talking to both parties, we could have avoided many of these PR, the public diplomacy, unnecessary disasters that we had in the last few days, or the last few weeks.
Speaking of management, I am not aware that the administration has mobilized a large team of seasoned peace process Middle East experts to do the work that will have to be done if the United States is serious about this next round. Perhaps they have. Scott, what is the pattern of the past been, and what is the Bush administration doing with respect to getting the necessary expertise and that is needed to do this immense task right?
That's a long question. Let me give you a short answer. And we talk about it a lot in the book. It'll come out in January. We'll buy it if you're interested. If you're not, if you're not interested, I won't take personal offense. And I'll just give you one anecdote. In 1993, Israelis and Palestinians they say we're going to get into this negotiating process, and we're going to culminate in the peace treaty and issues Jerusalem, refugees, settlement. It's all going to be there. We're going to talk about it all. And they broke through some major new ground when they said that in 1993. But what's my impression and what we found out in the research for this book is that over the 7 years between that moment and 2000, when the President of the United States brought Arab and Israeli leaders to Camp David, and then later this last-ditch diplomacy around Christmas time 2000, is that during those 7 years, we never developed what our positions would be on those issues, or what a menu of positions would be on those issues, or how we might bridge if the sides couldn't find a way to agree on those issues. And what happened is at the very last moment, it wasn't actually a moment, it was a period of a few weeks, maybe a few months, depending on who you ask, the American team, there's not that many more people than on this dais, had to turn to each other, well, okay, what are we going to do? These are big, thorny, tough, complicated, complex issues, and then we put some ideas forward, and they were a little rough edge. We hadn't thought about it. Now, you can say what you want to say about the last 7 years, but at a moment today, when the U.S. is inaugurating a process where we've asked Israeli and Palestinian leaders to talk about all these core issues, and where we've built a whole process, and the Annapolis conference, I was there Tuesday, they even had like an insignia. We branded this thing. There's like a graphic, and the words are wrapping around. We're asking them to do that at a minimum. If we've learned nothing from the past, we should have our own, the way we described it in an article last week, we should have our own back office, backroom operation, where American negotiators are developing our own ideas, our own sort of bridging proposals. It may not be one on Jerusalem or one on security. It could be a menu of options, because it's inevitable. The parties are going to turn to us because they're going to hit some stumbling blocks, and what are we going to say?
Daniel and Greg, are the Palestinian and Israeli teams still intact? And If not, will they draw on the experience of their predecessors who were so deeply involved for 10 years? And will these experts look at the volumes of studies, plans, documents like the Geneva Accord, of which Rafe and Daniel were the two co-drafters, to avoid having to reinvent the wheel?
Definitely, that's an absolute yes on the Palestinian side. Many of the negotiators are the same from Camp David, but more importantly, my institution, for example, the Negotiation Support Unit, what we've been doing for 7 years since the last negotiation is preparing for a relaunch of negotiations. So we have volumes and volumes of analyses and positions and options ready, a team of technical people, not political persons, to be able to support the political negotiators with a variety of options and analyses on what we hope is every possible scenario. So we're ready and we're encouraged that Annapolis will usher in that opportunity to finally make those decisions that we're ready to make.
I can give just as unequivocal an answer on the Israeli side. No, it's a different Israeli negotiating team. It's reflected in the change of governments on the Israeli side. It's already public knowledge that Foreign Minister Livni has invited and consulted with people who were involved in previous processes. I know, when she's also talked publicly at some times about the Geneva Initiative, I know that is on people's desks, as are other studies. I think there is an internalization on all sides that one of the lessons learned is get your heads around much more information on the Israeli and Palestinian sides. But I also think that that's important. I mean, this imbalance, I think, has been felt in the beginning of the negotiations. Saeb Erekat has probably forgotten more about negotiating history than the combined Israeli teams knew when they came into it. But there's a real positive to that, to having an additional group of senior Israeli elected officials and senior Israeli civil servants going through that process. Because Levi Eshkol, the former Israeli Prime Minister, once talked about how we play chess with ourselves, and we have to move away from playing chess with ourselves. The process of sitting hour after hour, meeting after meeting, will do something to those senior Israeli officials, and it will almost unequivocally do something quite positive and quite significant. Bottom line, though, we do kind of know the answers. I mean, this is a question of political decision. I would say, in that respect, also that I think Ehud Olmert showed an ability this week to evoke great national pride, and at the same time to demonstrate empathy with the other side. That's not an easy thing to pull off, and I think he deserves tremendous credit for having carried himself with such dignity in that respect. I say that because I place tremendous importance on the direct channel between Olmert and Abbas.
Thank you. Speaking of the issues, there is a question about Jerusalem. Is there a more or less understanding in the minds of the two sides and their negotiators of a way to break the impasse over Jerusalem? Or is this a deal breaker? Is it something that would fall into place if the other issues are resolved? Please say a word about Jerusalem. Anybody who would like.
I can say 3 words about Jerusalem. There are 3 issues to deal with in Jerusalem. I think we know them all. There is the big city of Jerusalem, and that everyone knows has to be divided more or less along the lines that President Clinton mentioned. What's Arab becomes Palestinian, what's Jewish is Israeli, capitals for 2 states. I think that's an easy one. The second one is what you do with the holy sites, the Haram Sharif Temple Mount. And with this, I mean, in reality and in practice, we know what's going to happen. Nothing's going to change. There will be access to both faiths, there will be no digging, there will be no changing of the religious significance. The one issue that is not yet resolved, I think will only resolve at the very end of the negotiation, is the symbolic issue of who has sovereignty. And I say it's symbolic because the practicality on the holy sites will be the same. It's a question of on the map who has sovereignty on this city, on this holy sites, and ultimately this is a political decision that we made in the end based on what you do with other political decisions, like do you have the word right of return or not have the word right of return. These are last-minute political compromises that will not affect the actual way the things are on the ground.
Thank you. One more question from a Jordanian embassy colleague. It's addressed to Danny. What is the minimum oxygen that is required on the issue of security to preserve momentum in its final status negotiating framework? And tell us more about how monitoring will work. Will there be specific American benchmarks which we will set and whose violation we will hold the parties accountable to? And what does holding them accountable mean? Does it mean some kind of sanctions or just a slap on the wrist? What good does it do to give a slap on the wrist to governments which are already beleaguered at home and under pressure from their radical adversaries?
You see, my argument would be aim for a really healthy big oxygen tank, but probably recognize that you're going to have to get by on La Paz, Bolivia levels of oxygen. And that's why I would recommend against envisaging a process that can be based on that oxygen over too long a period of time. I think also there's a political logic there. I don't think Omar probably has the entire duration of a term of office in which to do this. I imagine that might also be true of the Palestinian president, and obviously there's a timeline here in America. In terms of the details, that's why I emphasized, one of the reasons I emphasized the bringing Hamas and the pursue a ceasefire option. Because I think that is your most realistic path to a more sustainable security environment. And I think the ceasefire, which of course would have to be mutual, it would have to also involve not taking actions from the Israeli side. I think that kind of gives you the beginnings of the levels of oxygen necessary. In terms of the monitoring mechanism, I think it's a combination. I think a lot of it is private conversations. And that's why I talk about babysitting. I think if there's a serious American team on the ground, and I in no way detract from the seriousness of the Consul General in East Jerusalem or the ambassador in Tel Aviv, and I think they've actually been doing some solid work in trying to support this process. But they will need to be augmented by a specific team. That team will have to, I think, probably draw on its quartet allies in helping. There was one of the foreign ministers made a quip in his speech at Annapolis, because in the statement, of course, it says America will be the judge, and this foreign minister says, does that mean the rest of the world is the jury? But I think they'll have to be more than the jury. I think they'll have to assist. Because if the information, whether it be on settlements or on checkpoints, is coming through in a timely fashion, a lot of this can be done at the level of private conversation. I mean, I see the appointment of Jim Jones partly as someone who can look Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak in the eye and say, don't BS me. Some of the conversation might have to be a public conversation, but I think a lot of it, if it's effective, can be done privately.
Thank you, Daniel. I want to thank you all for wonderful questions. I didn't get to them all, but I think we covered most of them. I'd like to reserve the last 5 minutes for about a minute each from each of our panelists, in which if you exhausted your thoughts, you needn't speak again, but if you have something final to sum up with, go ahead. You each have 60 seconds.
If I may start, I mean, basically there are two ways of looking at after Annapolis. If you can look at Annapolis, you can find many faults, many mistakes, many ways to criticize it. That's fine. Where do we go from there? We go back to what we had 7 years ago. I believe we have an opportunity, or believe that we have a new process, and processes create their own dynamics and their own opportunities. And I would personally prefer to look at this as an opportunity rather than look at it cynically and let it slip away.
I think it's, sorry,
Go ahead.
No.
Let's see if I can do it in 60 seconds. I've been working on this throughout the past 2 hours, so 54. Since Scott mentioned pinball diplomacy, I've been thinking about pinballs, and as a great fan of the movie and of the Who, I wanted to say this to leave you with this one final thought. When you're in the Middle East, it is pinball all the time. The ball does travel back and forth. There's terrorism. There's all sorts of things that happen. Governments change, non-confidence motions and things like that. If the U.S. wants to be a pinball wizard, if it wants to be Tommy, it has to do something that Tommy wasn't able to do, which is to keep its eyes on the ball. What I mean by keeping its eyes on the ball is to really shepherd the final status negotiations through, despite anything that may happen in this kind of crazy pinball dynamic on the grounds. Not to repeat the old adage of previous administrations of we can't want this more than the parties themselves, but to say we want this. This is a vital American national security interest and we want this to happen.
I'm over-medicated, so I don't have anything clever like that to say. But I would say there's reason to be skeptical. We talked about a lot of that, but at the end of the day, this is a conflict the U.S. has had tremendous successes on over the years. A lot of our failures have been in the last few years, but take a long stretch of history, the last 35 years. And I don't believe our best days are behind us. I think the U.S., largely because of its relationship with Israel, largely because of the absence of any other kind of competitor on the international stage, largely because it is so important to us, and largely because we do have such a rich past as a successful negotiator. That there's a lot that can still be accomplished, and luckily this isn't the last month of the administration. They've got a good year, and I think a lot can be done, and I hope all of you ask the right questions to our negotiators and to our leaders in these next few months, because they need to be asked. And I have to thank Laura Friedman too for setting this up and inviting me.
If I could just add, it would be a tremendous gift to the next administration and to the United States, the Israelis and the Palestinians, if this is a process that is sustained and completed by the end of George W. Bush's second term. It is quite possible, indeed probable, that such a huge accomplishment will take longer, but that if there is a successful process plan moving forward rapidly, the next administration will not have to wait for 6 months or a year before it gets its act together. It can pick the process up where it has left off. That has almost never happened in American politics, but that would be a tremendous blessing. Dan?
Well, I think the peace process has resembled the parrot from the Monty Python sketch for the last 7 years. And it's looked more like it's dead than pining for the fjords of Norway. We're in a place now where the parrot looks credibly like it has some oxygen in its lungs. That's much better, I think, for the US to succeed. We've given constructive suggestions here as to what they need to do. When I hear a line like, when liberty takes root on the rocky soil of the West Bank of Gaza, it will inspire millions across the Middle East, that the President said 2 days ago, I worry. Yeah. Because I think Iraq and I think mismanagement. And so that takes me to the final point, which is, and this is also a political consideration, we should be saying yes to engagement, but trying to hold people's feet to the fire on getting the nature of the engagement right. And then it's all down to what Ori said, because he nailed it. American interest, American interest, American interest. And I hope the back room is in your office. That would be
Please, the final word.
I'm not dedicated enough to come up with something that creative. Again, just focus on positivism. There's a lot that the US can do. It has to be pushed. Secretary has good intentions. She has real commitment. She has to be encouraged. That's what I would
Thank you. Greg?
When you brought up the image, Daniel, of the parrot and Monty Python, I couldn't help but think of another classic Monty Python moment which was the knight who had all of his limbs chopped out, was left there. Yeah, and said, wait, I still have my teeth, I still have my teeth, you know. And unfortunately, that's the paradigm that we're hearing from a lot of skeptics about the peace process, that, you know, come on, this is, it's over, there's no more hope. But the fact of the matter is that there is hope. It's not an easy process. We're still there. It's still possible to implement a two-state solution. And I just want to leave you with one very basic observation. And that is this. Could we have imagined even a few weeks ago, I mean, I was working on this process. I was part of the delegation at Annapolis. And that just several weeks later, the United States would have brought together nearly the entire world to say to Israelis and Palestinians, we are with you, we're not going to tell you what to do, but we're going to support you. Here's the forum, here's your platform, it's time for this issue to be solved. Yes, it's not a military strategic threat to the rest of the world, but what it is a geopolitical threat that destabilizes the region and everyone's security interests, not just a human tragedy. Could we have imagined that we have Syria, Saudi Arabia in the same room with Israel, Palestine, Indonesia, Malaysia, France, Germany, saying, we bless this process, here's the framework, here's the Arab Peace Initiative that the US Senate has even endorsed. These are things we've never had before. And yeah, we have a lot of reason to say, oh yeah, here we go again. I still have my teeth. But look, we've got something to look forward to. Let's make sure we make the most of it. It may be the last opportunity, but let's go forward.
Thank you.